everybody. Hello. So welcome to our session. Whoops, here we go. Welcome to our session, Podcasting in the Global South. There's two amazing things happening today. One is this session. Clearly, you made it. And the other one is like, this is my first time hosting a panel, so I don't know. But this isn't about me. Yes, we can start that presentation, by the way. These are these amazing speakers that we have here on the panel. To our right, we've got Ramsey, we've got Carolina, and Josephine. And you'll hear a lot more from them soon. I am Jasmin Bauomy. I am the head of audio at Blinkist. I'm a freelance audio producer, podcast producer, and I am a co-facilitator at Spotify's Sound Up program in Germany. And I do a lot of other things, but we don't have to get into that. A few housekeeping things. You can either, if you're watching and you're not in the room, you can send questions to my Twitter handle, which is at Jasmin Bauomy. It's up there. Or there will be a little bit of a Q&A afterwards. And if we don't have enough time, we're going to have drinks later on at the Brufani. So come join us, meet these panelists. So much for that. And now we can start. Oh no, the presentation's already going. All right, let's do this. No, I'm not nervous at all. Okay. This is the opportunity. We're talking about podcasting in the Global South. There are around 1.5 billion English speakers worldwide. That's first language and second language and third language English speakers. But the podcasts that are being produced, most of them are made for and by North Americans and Western Europeans, and hence are targeted more towards like 46 million of speakers, of English speakers worldwide, thereby excluding more than 1 billion people. Now that is huge, and that's just the English language, which means 70%, roughly, please don't quote me on those numbers, but roughly 70%, numbers disagree, of the world population doesn't speak English. There are podcasts in more than 100 languages, and we're not listening. Like, they haven't even made a blip on our radar. So it's time to listen in, because the big ones, they've started listening. So from Spotify to Google to Amazon, people have come to start to invest into these areas, and there may be a big opportunity here. These are people who are making stories in a way and telling stories in a way that we haven't told them before, and they get a voice now, and it's pretty awesome. So we have our first panelist, Josephine, who will tell us about her area. Josephine, take it away.
I'll start again. Good evening, everyone. Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to our amazing moderator and everyone who's put this together. I bring greetings from our colleagues at Africa Podfest who are based in Nairobi, Lusaka, Johannesburg, Cape Town, London, Dusseldorf, Los Angeles, all around the world, an all-African team. And I bring special greetings from our community of African podcasters. And this is a group of special people indeed. Africa's podcasting landscape is new, but podcasting isn't new to Africa. There are over, I would say probably 1,500 podcasts you can find. There's probably about 400 more that you can find on our website. We've created a database that you can search. And the opportunity that I've found is that with every market, there are rock stars. The only problem is you haven't found out about them yet. One of the things that I do at Africa Podfest is that we coordinate, we connect, and we create opportunities for people to find each other, share skills and expertise in podcasting. I'm a podcaster myself, and because of the frustration of trying to create my own podcast around 2018, I got together with my co-founders at Africa Podfest. Melissa Mbogwa is my co-director, and we've started a movement to raise awareness about African podcasting. Before I go very far, I'd like to call attention to what you're seeing on the screen behind me and in front of you is a map of Africa with 3 countries highlighted. The very bottom is South Africa. To the left or right. In the middle is Kenya and Nigeria. Those are the three big podcasting markets. There are many, many languages across Africa. There are nearly 2,000 unique languages. We podcast mainly in English. There are Francophone podcasts, there are Arabic podcasts, Kiswahili, and so on. There are fusion podcasts that create a balance between local language and experience, as well as try to connect to Africans within the continent and the diaspora. We've found through our research that most of the podcast listeners are female. We have other podcasters who've tried to do their own surveys that found that most of the podcast listeners across Africa are male. We're trying to figure out which is which, because there isn't quite as much data about African podcasting as there could be. You'll see that we do three things. We do original research about podcasting. We create opportunities for community around podcasting in and around Africa. We've created the Discovery Tour of African Podcasting, which has allowed us to meet virtually, because of the current situation we are in, podcasters in Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa. We've connected with podcasters in Egypt, Zambia, and everywhere in between. And we also create our own podcasts, and we are really, really interested in creating podcasts that reach across Africa. So Africa Podfest is here to stay. We invented a special day on the calendar called Africa Podcast Day. It's on the 12th of February every year. And some of you have attended it, some of you haven't. What we've done is created a space where people can explore podcasting, can learn from each other and others in the podcasting space. And the criteria is your podcast is about Africa, from Africa, or from the African diaspora, based on the theme of the year. This year's theme was Podcasting is Freedom. And so Africa and African podcasting and our story are your stories as well, and I hope we'll get a chance to talk a little bit more about how those connections happen.
Thank you so much, Josephine. That works, right? Yeah, sorry. Thanks. That gave us a really good lay of the land of what's happening in Africa, and I think you're doing really important work. All three of you are really shaking things up where you are. How about you, Carolina? Do you want to tell us about what the podcast landscape is where you are, and also about the projects that you're involved in?
Yeah, so hi everyone. Thank you, Jasmin, for inviting me. And I'm very happy to be here and to tell you more about what we do. I think I have a slide that only has our logos. And some like nice illustrations. I'm representing Rambulante and El Hilo. We have two podcasts now. We launched the company that is called Radio Ambulante Studios 10 years ago, based in San Francisco, California. My co-founder who's also the host of Rambulante, the podcast, has written a novel about radio in the Andes, and after that he was invited to do a documentary, an audio documentary with a BBC producer in his native Peru, his native country, and he traveled for a month, did a bunch of interviews, and then went back to the United States. And a month later, when he received the final mix of the story, all the voices that he felt were more compelling and that made the story were left out, because those voices were in Spanish. So he was left with these questions, no? What if there were a space for those voices, and how will it sound like? So a couple of years later, we met, and we decided to create that space together. We also are married. That is a different story, but this came in a conversation when I was trying to start up like a storytelling project, more thinking on video, and he one day said, let's do this thing. We were based in the United States, and we were avid admirers of shows that we could listen on public media, the public radio, like This American Life or Radio Lab. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them. It's long-form audio, and we wanted to create that. So when we launched Rambulante in May 2012, we started telling stories from everywhere where Spanish spoken in Latin America and in the United States. We consider the United States another Latin American country because it's full of like almost 60 million people who who speak Spanish or understand Spanish, and we believe that political borders are real, but cultural borders are very fluid, and I think we are here just because technology allows us to do this, like break these borders or imaginary borders. So we have produced Rambulante. It's a weekly podcast. We produce 30 episodes every year. And these are it's kind of like long form personal stories, storytelling, universal stories. 1 week there is a story from Chile, and the next week it can be from the Bronx in New York. And the idea is that universal stories really cross borders, and this is kind of like the format on this. A couple of years later, we launched a second podcast called El Hilo. El Hilo means in Spanish, it's thread, like when you open a thread on Twitter. And this is a weekly podcast. We produce 50 episodes per year, and it's more like an explainer. Every week we tell the most important story of Latin America, and we talk with experts and journalists about a theme. No? So last week we had El Salvador, and this week, with this Friday, it comes on Fridays. This Friday we were telling the story about a new law in Florida that is very restrictive, affects directly the Latino community. It's called Don't Say Gay. So we change and we try to bring, with two podcasts, we reach Latinos and Latin Americans. And sometimes people ask me, who is your audience? And we don't see, before I used to say that we have three audiences. One are Latin Americans everywhere, then Latinos in the US first, second, third generation, and we also have like many people who are Spanish learners, like a percentage of Spanish learners. But at the end, I think it's just one audience with a legitimate desire and interest on Latin America issues and on expanding the curiosity and learn about the world. So this is kind of the audience that we serve. We are focused on two things. We have built a community around Rambulante that is very loyal and is very, we nurture and grow this community constantly and try to spark interesting conversations and do gatherings. We can talk about that later. But also what we try is to break the barrier of language and other kind of barriers, no? Like bringing stories of new voices and neglected voices to the airwaves that otherwise nobody will maybe like learn about them. I think I will leave it there, so I will leave the rest for questions.
Thank you so much, Carolina. 30 episodes a year. Anybody who has ever made a narrative podcast episode knows how much friggin' 50 or 30?
It's 30 from Rambulante, 50 for El Hilo. Still
Okay.
80. It's a lot of work.
Anybody who's ever done that knows how much work that is. That is a lot. And I'm saying a lot. So thank you. That is amazing. Ramsey, our man from the Middle East.
Yeah, thank you. It's really nice to be here, and thank you to the festival. It's my first time, and it's been lovely. I hope it's not my last. I'm really happy to be here with other amazing people. So we come from the Middle East. Our organization is called Sowt, and depending on how it's spelled, it can either mean voice or sound. And that's what we focus on. So in 2015, there was this pivot to video. Everybody was looking at video and how we can do video. And when anybody asked me, I didn't put a slide in, yeah, sorry. No, it's okay. When everybody was pivoting to video, and someone would ask me, have you considered video? I would say absolutely not and walk away. So we tried to be very focused on audio, and in a similar sense, we felt that there was this opportunity, there was a space, there were lots of stories. We come from a very rich, diverse cultural, linguistic, and religious background, and a lot of that doesn't come through the mainstream media and through other non-mainstream media. And so this is where we felt our opportunity was. And so the situation in podcasting, I would assume everybody knows what a podcast is. I hope you've listened, and if you don't, you should start. But the situation in the Middle East for podcasts are there. Maybe 3 years ago, there was about 150, 200, and today I think there's around 1,500 active podcasts. And by active, I think we mean publishing around once a month. And the listenership has gone from, very small to millions and millions every day. And I can track that on what we do. So the work that we do, we have around 25 podcasts that we produce every year for us. And then we also work with white label partners, clients, and whatnot, and we produce for them. So we, last year, to 2021, we published, I believe, 370 episodes last year. And so the year before that, it was 250. The year before that was 100, 120. So the scale has really gone up, and the audience has gone up even faster than that. So it's interesting that we see the audience growing. But to go into those numbers a bit more, if you look at our main show, it's called Aib, and Aib in Arabic means inappropriate or taboo. And the senior producer for that show is actually right here, Tala. And the idea with that show is that we don't take a judgment, we don't take a stand, but you hear the unique voice of the people telling their story. And so the idea is that this is a podcast about gender and sexuality, and really the idea is that people tell their own story. We don't say it's right, we don't say it's wrong, what you should or you shouldn't do, we just hear their story. And people resonate with that, whether they agree or they disagree with what is being said. People really enjoy that. And so that storytelling aspect is key to our work, and I think to other people here today. And so the other idea that I wanted to focus on, so there's this main idea of content. We, at the beginning, 2016, started to think about ideas. By 2017, we had 3 shows that we were publishing. Like I said, now we're up to around 25. So that's one part, content. There was a gap in Arabic narrative-driven content. Let's produce as much as we can and see what we can do with that. The other aspect was a community-based model where we started doing listening parties. We would bring people together, whether it was 5 or 10 or sometimes 50 or more, people together. We'd listen to a little clip, sometimes a reporter, sometimes the editor, sometimes a guest would be there, and we would talk about it. And this was an interesting way to engage directly with the community, to listen, to hear, to get feedback. The final kind of aspect of what we do is to engage in a political discussion. It's very easy to just have conversations. It's very easy to get scared, and especially in the Middle East, it's a fraught political discourse where it's easy to be put into a box. And so for us, our idea, again, was to engage in this political discussion, to engage in a political conversation, and not at the same time be put into any one box. So it's very easy to say these are leftists, these are the Muslim Brotherhood, these are conservative, these are liberal, these are progressive, and whatnot. So our idea, again, was to really focus on the storytelling aspect of that and try to avoid being put into any one box. And in some ways, it's a reflection of who we are, right? I think someone was talking about recently this idea of the bonfire. So, for thousands of years, we would sit at night and we would stare at a fire, humans, us. And so this idea of having a bonfire to bring us together, it was a really interesting idea. And we're different, we're diverse, we reflect many different parts of society. And so this is built into all of our content and our work. And that way, in a lot of ways, it's been a nice way to avoid being labeled. So I will stop there. We'll get into more questions, but that's a quick introduction.
Thank you so much, Ramsey. I really like what you said about giving people the tools, or just like letting people tell their own stories. That's something I can definitely also relate to. I used to work for Al Jazeera and helped Al Jazeera start, or supported Al Jazeera in starting 2 of their podcasts back in the day. So that's, by the way, my Global South background. And in case you were wondering. And one of these episodes that I'm most proud of was where we just had a bunch of people in Yemen, 2 people in Yemen, send us voice notes, little diaries, and it was unbelievably impactful for them to tell their own story. And all we did is put it together, and it was really, really impactful. So that is one type of format that you can do. I mean, this was targeted towards I guess, the entire world, the entire global south, anybody who was interested back then at Al Jazeera's coverage and needed a different take on that war. But there are other formats for the global south. So I'm curious to all three of you, like, are there certain formats that you think kind of like stand out? What formats work in your areas, in the areas that you're active in? I also want to add, neither of those areas are monoliths. Clearly, each one has their own experience, and we can't speak for everybody there. But they definitely are experts that can give an insight. So, Josephine, do you want to tell us what formats work that you've seen?
Yes, I would. One of the things that started off podcasting across Africa is music podcasts. So people became very familiar with their favorite DJs, starting a podcast, and then they discovered podcasts on platforms like SoundCloud, and that's how they started figuring out that short-form audio could be portable, this podcast concept could continue. The other area that's very popular with new podcasters especially is the interview format, where a lot of podcasters across Africa, some of whom are watching and tweeting, thank you very much, are creating shows that have short interviews with people in their community. I'll give an example. One of the podcasts that we've interacted with is called Dandora Hip Hop City. And they have a short interview segment where they interview different community players who can help people in Dandora, in Nairobi, a specific area, to understand issues going on in their communities. And what we've learned from them is that they don't, the format that they use as an interview setup is for Facebook, even though they put their podcast on podcast platforms, and the language that they use in the interviews is very local to where they are and their community experience. So you have a lot of podcasters knowing that a lot of the listeners are outside of their community, focusing on niche communities or smaller, more laser-focused podcasts. You also have a lot of media makers crossing over and creating content that fights misinformation, that tries to call attention to issues that have fallen off the national and international radar, which is a big problem, especially with stories coming out of Africa. So you have individual storytellers trying to use the medium to create this really rich and short format. The other area that is really growing is formats that can be shared easily on WhatsApp. So voice notes, as Jasmine has mentioned, and also what happens is that the voice notes end up being community connectors. If we were here and we were trying to speak to someone who was in another part of the same county, what people usually do is record the story, the meeting, and share that across WhatsApp or share it across Telegram. And then one person on the other side will download it and play it for a room, like those of us who are sitting here. And so that becomes a really good way of understanding how podcasts are being changed in terms of their formats. There are some there's some podcasts that have grown out of what's commonly understood. So you have some fiction podcasts coming out based loosely on historical events. You have historical podcasts because, again, history is always rewritten in the textbooks. And so podcasts are going back to the source of these stories to try and help people really understand what happened across Africa. And there's some correlation with what Ramsey said about the storytelling aspect being a big part of these podcasts and drawing people in. So there's that really big spread of formats for podcasting as well.
Thanks. How about you, Carolina? Is there a certain format that really worked in the Hispanic world?
So in the United States, because we are based in the United States, in New York, but our team of almost 30 people works remotely from more than 12 countries in Latin America. So we feel that we are a podcast in the United States that tells Latin American stories, but also a Latin American podcast that is based in the United States. We have that duality. So in the United States, probably like if you know about podcasts, it's like the narrative format is kind of like very popular. And then comedy, children, and fiction are also very common now. In Latin America, I think we are natural storytellers, or most Latin Americans. I'm not sure if I'm that natural. But even like if there is a lot of desire, and the popular has been like more popular, is becoming more popular in the last 2 or 3 years that Spotify is penetrating the market, has penetrated the market, and now people know, oh, what is a podcast? Oh, can you recommend any podcast? So there is a lot of desire to produce narrative long-form podcast, but that requires a lot of investment, and I think our producers are still, I mean, like Latin American producers still need to find a business model or find more, there should be more commitment from like media and other funders. So, but probably that will come. And I know that because Rambulante has been out for 10 years and we receive a lot of requests of people trying to create those. But there are many, at the beginning in Latin America, there was a lot of like the latest radio shows uploaded to as a podcast. And now we see many new podcast creators, a lot of conversational podcast, technology, or like just interviewing. So and in Mexico, the format is growing very much. I think it's the place, and next with Brazil. Brazil is crazy with podcasts. But Mexico is also like growing a lot, and they have a lot of like storytelling, kind of like telling stories more than storytelling. Is more like go there and talk about a story and tell a story. A lot of meditation podcasts and well-being are very popular. I should get one of, I should listen to more than this. Yeah, and news podcasts.
Interesting. I should listen to more meditation podcasts. I agree. Ramsey, you already mentioned earlier you have a show called Aib that is possibly one of the 2 most popular shows that you have. Have you seen, why is it so popular? What do you think? And have you seen other formats that really seem to work? You had talked earlier about like making podcasts as a political act. Does that play into the formats?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so Aib, like I mentioned, I think works really well for several reasons. One, the format itself allows for and almost encourages this very personal narrative storytelling. It's a very personal act to produce Aib and to interview someone who is telling you their very personal, deeply touching story. It's very difficult. It can be very difficult to do this on video. It's intimidating. We have these screens in front of us, lights and cameras, and it gets very intimidating very quickly. With a podcast and the audio format, you can stay anonymous very easily. You can do it in a way that's much more personal. You can do it in a way that is much more intimate. And so that lends itself very well to the subject of sexuality and gender. I think one of the other things that I wanted to mention is that we noticed at the 5-6 years ago that there were lots of interview podcasts, like Joe Rogan and whatnot. Some of these shows that are very popular, usually a man talking to another man about like man things and whatnot. So it's very easy to get into that format and do that. And I think you see that reflection here is that definitely by itself is a political act to kind of provide other voices and other perspectives. And so I think, doing that, we saw the opportunity to focus on narrative storytelling, where we helped people tell their stories. So there is a lot of work. It's not as easy as just 2 microphones and you start talking. There's interviews, there's identifying the cases, and once you even identify the guest, there's lots of work with them to help them tell that story in a way that is interesting to someone else. I wanted to mention too that there's this idea, there's like 3 main ways to try to convince someone or communicate: ethos, pathos, and logos. So logos is logic, pathos is emotion, and ethos is an ethical kind of argument. This is right. This is it will make you feel good if you do this. It's 1 + 1 should equal 2. But there was a fourth, and others, but there was a fourth one that kind of got dropped off as the Western canon was solidified. And that was mythos, this idea of story. And it's shocking that we kind of forget that, because a lot of our founding beliefs come from stories. Religious documents were not documents at the beginning. They were stories told around a fire. And so this is a really powerful kind of idea that we are excited about exploring in a digital and a new format. So I can say that talk shows are very popular. They do work very well. we're not so interested in that format, although it is popular. We're very much focused on the narrative. I want to say just a couple really quickly about format. So the idea of length is really important in a podcast, obviously. So we've experimented with things that are up to maybe an hour, probably not much longer than that, all the way down to something that's 4 or 5, 6 minutes long. And we think there's space for all of it, right? We're not one of those where it has to be long form, it has to be et cetera, or the shorter the better. It's a race to the bottom. So there's formats that work for both. And one of the shows that actually is quite similar to El Hilo, or Thread, it's a great name, by the way, that you can do both in the same feed. So every Sunday morning, which is the first day of our week in the Middle East, most of us, an episode drops at around 6 a.m., and it's an explainer talking about what's happening. It's not the news, it's talking about the news. That show was doing okay for us. We wanted to figure out a different way. And it's called El Mustajad, which means like the new, something new. And then we did something called El Mustajad Jiddan, so like the very new thing. And that is a much shorter, it's usually like a meme or something that's happening online. And so in the same feed, we're experimenting with 2 different formats. And we have to say it's working. It's fun to produce. It's also very fun to listen to. It's doubled the output of the team, which is hard. But we think it's working really well. So to kind of end that there's still a lot of experimentation that needs to happen.
I think it's really fascinating. I'm hearing a lot of different formats here, and there's been this, I don't know if it's a stereotype, but definitely a cliche about people in the global south being amazing storytellers because we've like sat around fires for ages and have worn turbans and et cetera, et cetera. But we're still oftentimes still experimenting. There's a lot of experimentation going on, what works and what doesn't work. Are we trying to imitate whatever NPR is doing and BBC and et cetera? Yeah.
So just building on what you guys are saying is like, it's because it's like we're talking about like the kind of like stories and all that, but it's like with sound, you also tell a story with the music. So for example, at Rambulante and both podcasts, we compose our own music, and then we have the sound design. So all the scoring is original, and then it's like also like finding that balance, like on the experimentation that you mentioned as well. It's like, yeah, one episode is just like it's being unpacked in front of you while you listen. This is happening, or sometimes if it's a story, you're telling something that happened past in the future, like 20 years ago. So you have a different format. And I think what is interesting or motivating about like the storytelling part of the format is that every episode can be something completely different, and the power that we have as creators is like that creative power. It's just like telling a different story in the next episode and the next episode, and also like giving the opportunity, because there is a team, and we have like 3 sound designers now, because at the beginning we couldn't afford it, but they also tell like play instrument, they design a whole universe, and probably I'm telling something that you already know if you're a podcast creator, but that's that's also like the experimentation is really like has no limits in podcasting.
Which is awesome, but it also means you're throwing stuff at the wall to see what sticks, right? So I tried to look at data. You saw the data that I presented. It is lacking, right? Let's be honest. So why is that? Why is it so hard to get your hands on data from the areas that you're active in? And how do you get your hands on data? Because at the end of the day, you need to, ask for money sometimes to be able to support your productions, and those people want data. How do you go about that?
So by and large, what we found was a lot of the listenership data that's available right now on podcast listeners is focused on audiences outside of Africa. And if it's within Africa, it's one country. So Edison did a study in 2019 about South Africa, but that's about it. In the middle of looking for that data about who's listening to podcasts, we found that there weren't really great tools for podcasters to kind of parse through their data. So it's great that podcasters could tell us, people from 67 countries clicked on my podcast. But then there wasn't really any kind of new data about whether the people who are listening to their podcasts are in urban areas or rural areas. Are they young? Are they old? So we at Africa Podfest started with a question of who, and asked ourselves whether we could start with a Kenya survey, because we're based in Kenya, and Kenya is a pretty advanced market in Africa in terms of podcasting, and ask ourselves who was listening. So thinking through the question of who is listening led us to the question of when do they listen? A lot of people knew a podcast is listened to when you're commuting, but when you're commuting in Nairobi, where I'm from, the average time that you spend in traffic depends on the day of the week. It could be an hour, it could be 2 hours, and everybody in a public setting listens to radio. And so when thinking about podcasts that are 25 minutes long, because the average commute of maybe somebody in New York or London or Amsterdam is 25 minutes, that changed what we understood about podcasting. We switched gears and started talking to podcasters in different African countries, and started in 2020 when we explored not just who's listening and what time are they listening and what kinds of podcasts do they want to listen to, and switched into the country experience. So if you're podcasting in Sierra Leone, what makes your diaspora audience the most important audience is the history of Sierra Leone. If you're in Tanzania and you're podcasting in Kiswahili, why do you need to use both Kiswahili and English and other languages that you're fluent in? And we found that there was a rich layer of responses from podcasters, which helped us now start talking about the technical infrastructure in different countries, that people couldn't afford to access data all the time, even to upload their podcasts, to stream other people's podcasts. And if the power was, electrical power, what we take for granted, was consistent in their country, it might not allow them to fully upload their podcasts, listen to other podcasts, listen into a training session from someone who's maybe doing a free session online. So those are some of the things we identified by the data itself. So what's still not known is, because we've done some work in Kenya, academicians have also started writing about podcasts, and so we know a little bit more from the academic literature. What's not known is, because there are so many countries, are we limiting our perspective by only exploring these countries? So that's where the money comes in. A lot of this data that the large companies have collected is invested in, and so a lot more investment is needed to create much more nuanced pictures of the data in Africa, and for us to be able to say, yes, in Kenya, if you want to listen to podcasts, definitively, this is how listeners are creating their data.
Thanks, Josephine. I find it, with the data, I find it really interesting because a lot of news organizations want to get their foot in the podcasting business these days, and they want to especially get into the global south, etc., and they're thinking of other languages, so they want data. Carolina, you've been doing this for 10 years. You probably have collected a lot of data up until this point. How do you go about this?
Yeah, so when we launched Rambulante, it was launched on SoundCloud, and we were independently produced. We are still independently produced, but we have a distribution agreement with NPR, so we're part of the NPR family in the United States since 2016. And so now so at the time there was like some information, geolocation and numbers and metrics that we were monitoring as much as we could, and we also started surveying our audience very early, since the beginning, and so we learned about them. And what we used to do is to cross information. But then so now, like for Rambulante is the metrics. We have a lot of information and data that NPR brings, more like the metrics and locations. So for example, like if somebody, I have one listener in Caparrapi, Colombia, little town, I can see that on the information, and also like I can decide what metrics we want. We want to monitor the first 24 hours, first 5 days, 7 days, month, depending on the episode, we just have different variables. So that's useful, combined with our surveys that are replied by 6,000 people, around 6,000 people. We get a lot of information and work with a data research specialist. We put all that information on Tableau. It's a lot of data analysis, and we cross information. that's as soon as we got money, we started investing on that because it's so important to know who your audience is. And then with this, we launched recently these listening clubs that are like this, like some of our listeners like host this gathering, these listening parties, as my my friends here, and people talk about it, and we started listening also like another dimension to what they like use the content for, how they can react. For El Hilo is now a co-production with Vice News, so and that's on Acast, and Acast has like very great numbers. But the thing is that in the industry, I can tell you like we have like 35 million downloads accumulated, or we have like 9 million downloads per year in Rambulante, but it will be like 3 million per year this year for Vice. Which is great because we see the project growing. But if you go and try to get that data from other shows in Latin America, there are not still those numbers. I think Spotify has like, they create this, they show a lot, but they don't share metrics specifically about the shows. You work with them, so I don't know. But it's just so hard. You want to, let's cross promote, and yes, but I can't share. And I'm like, no, because this is a negotiation. And I think the metrics available in the United States is because there is a business, and the advertising is the big business model for podcast. So we hope to see that as the industry grows in Latin America as well. But it's really like just we have to do it ourselves.
Yeah, I can just say a few things. I mean, I think one of the main challenges for sure for podcasting is data, just the way RSS feed works. So most, I can just say this just so we're all on the same table. RSS is real simple syndication. It's an old technology. It's great. It works really well. It's open source. Nobody owns it. But what we're seeing now is that you don't get a lot of data back from it. And now what we're seeing is, bigger platforms like Apple, Spotify, even NPR to some extent, they want people to listen on their apps so that they can get that data. And so this is definitely a major challenge for a lot of us to do that and to get more data to learn about what's happening. That is definitely one of the challenges. I think too for us is also what to do with that data. I mean, we've done different studies and surveys and talked to people and whatnot, and it's really hard to figure out, what to do with that. Like what, next steps do I take based on, these 13 people that said something. And I think that maybe is a good segue into kind of business and business models and whatnot. So we do a little bit of subscription, we do a little bit of ad sales, but roughly 55% of our revenue is commercial and 45% is grant-based. So without grants, it would be very hard to function. Without the commercial revenue, it would also be very hard to function. And so for us, as again, engaging in that political, to be independent, to be an independent media, especially in a place where there is little independent media, that diversity of revenue sources is really important. We're experimenting more with that. And again, what does success look like? Is it syndication with a major platform? Is it more ad sales? Is it subscription? But again, if we're trying to get people to listen, putting it behind a paywall creates all kinds of issues. So there's lots of kind of other ideas to think about. We were talking, I think our friend from Portugal is here, and they publish, they have a complete different publishing model, but they have subscribers or members actually, so it's not behind a paywall. And that provides a significant part of their revenue. So there's lots of models to try in different places in the world.
All right, thanks for the segue. So we can move on to the business models. Karina, you've tried with a different business model. Ramsey already mentioned membership. What was your experience?
Yeah, so we have used the data.
Sorry, just a quick one. Can you explain what the difference is between subscription and membership, just to people?
Yeah. So I'm gonna I explain while I talk. Subscription is when you are like explain your subscription and I explain my membership.
Sure. So subscription is where, for us, is where we put stuff, either it's behind a paywall, so it's exclusive, it's ad-free, so a freemium model, or there's kind of extra content that you get. I think yeah, so that's what we do for subscription, and it depends on what show and what timing and whatnot. Some of it stays exclusive, some of it comes off exclusive after a while. But
Yeah, so for us, we have a membership program that was launched like in the fall of 2019, and it's just like people who supports our work and feel that it added value to their lives. They support with a fine. They either donate an amount of money every month or every year. At the moment, we have like 40. Camilo works with me, so I think we're 4,800 paid members now. The program has grown a lot. I was very reticent to launch it 2 years ago because I was. Okay, I will talk about our membership program and go back to our business model because I really think it's very interesting. So with the membership it has become very important in our business model. And because it was recently launched, we realized in the latest surveys, we asked people, will you be able to support our work? What podcast do you want to listen in Spanish? And we realized people wanted a news podcast that we really were not thinking to do, but we heard them, and we launched and created El Hilo. And then we also asked, will you be able to support this? And they said with at least $5 per month, and 60% of like the 6,500 people who responded the survey said, yes, I will support you. So with that information, we just like launched like membership program and also like created another podcast. And it worked. I mean, like people are listening to it. It's not, I mean, it's growing, but it's really popular. So that's how like we created this on business model. And now this membership program has grown to bring 20% of the annual budget of the company only in 2 years, which is amazing because 2 years ago I didn't have that 20% covered. So in terms of business model, Rambulante Studios, the company is a non-profit organization. Early when we created Rambulante in the United States, people used to say, oh, I always wanted to do that. Oh, this is so important. And then we were knocking doors at foundations, grants, and everything was shut down. Why don't you do it in English? We were no one on radio. We had to learn radio to put together, to create Rambulante. So we realized, wow, this is going to be hard. And it took us like 5 years to build relationships with foundations. We had like a small grants, and then so we have like grants right now of MacArthur and for foundation, that are main bigger grants, multi-year for general capacity, and they bring like 20% of the annual budget. We have created these partnerships. So in the case of Rambulante, is with NPR, and in the case of El Hilo, with Vice News. But the way we do partnerships is that we put the conditions on this. I was reticent about that because when you have a small company, there is always someone who comes and to offer their help, right? But we don't need help; we need money. But we really appreciate the big infrastructure. So yeah, some help. At the end, I understood that. Yeah, some help helps. I mean, it helps to have a company like NPR or Vice News who like that they bring to the table a lot of like the product size and metrics and all this infrastructure that is very data that is expensive to build. But in general, what we do is that close these deals, protecting our independence, editorial independence, and that has worked. And so these are revenue, like split revenue deals. They find advertising and we split the amount, and they give us minimum guarantees per year so we can project our the budget. And on the last thing that I want to say is that also we do on our surveys, since the day one, we realized that we had so many Spanish learners who were not Latinos. They didn't identify as Latino, or Spanish was their native language. And it was always like a percentage, like 20%, you know, like, and when you're a designer, you know who you are, like, creating things for, but this was like so constant and growing again. And then we decided to create this app that is called Lupa app, and Lupa transforms our stories in great lessons, so you can it's a paid app for Spanish learners that offers a better experience at listening to Rambulante. You can read while you listen, lower the voice, select vocabulary. We have 50 different accents from all the continent, select clips and these kind of things. So we partnered with a technology company to do that, and that app is growing and is bringing 10% of the annual budget.
Wow, that's what I call a diverse way to make revenue. Josephine, you have a lot to say. It's all good. It's all good.
I could listen to Ramsey and Carolina, talk about these models, and for a long time actually. So one of the things that individuals, I think where we're at in African podcasting is that we're learning from each other a lot, and there's a lot of room in terms of the innovative ways that people are asking, where is the money in African podcasting? So one, I think what we've done at Africa Podfest is really model what individual contributors could do and what that looks like. And what we've said consistently is, if you enjoy this podcast, please support their work, and not just by thumbs up or liking. Please, we've asked content creators, create a way for people to send you money. And in countries where they use mobile money, a lot of the creators are actually saying, hey, my new season is out. If you want to be listening to my podcast, here is an amount of money. It's usually just what you can afford for 4 episodes, and you'll be exclusive. You'll get to access them. You'll get to listen to them. And that way, podcasters get something to put back in their pocket. It's incentive. It creates that pipeline. The second kind of innovative way that we found is that people do have listening events and shows where African podcasters call all their audiences and say, hey, we're going to do a live recording and we're going to sell tickets, and you can listen to us and engage with us and create content with us and be part of our story. And so it's this idea of creating community, but also sustaining the real costs of actually podcasting as well. For our two, I think I got this question maybe while we're coming in the door. How do we fund Africa Podfest? We do create similar to Ramsey. So there's grants for what we work on in terms of our festival, and then in terms of production, it's commercial work. So producing commercial podcasts for white label clients, and also creating opportunities for our own work through partnerships. So currently our podcast on African podcasting is a partnership between ourselves, a company called Podcast Laundry, AfriPods, and Semabox. So we're modeling what partnership and shared resources looks like, so that podcasters can pick up these models and also create ways of connecting amongst each other. So those are some of the ways that for African podcasters, we are the ones who fund everything. And so we try and figure out then how do we build consortiums or partnerships and model those, just knowing that the context will change and does change from country to country, from region to region, from political context to political context. That makes a huge difference.
Thanks. And since I have you on the mic, Josephine, and we're almost running out of time, I have a long list of questions, and they have so many amazing answers, so I really hope you get in touch with them. Yeah. But from what I've seen across the African continent, that's where the most innovation has been taking place in terms of distribution. Because there is an issue with bandwidth, with internet. More people do have smartphones, so that's great. Right. But how do they get their podcasts? So what innovative ideas have people come up with to distribute podcasts?
So one of the things that makes a huge difference is the presence of, and Meta and other companies has been the main way that a lot of people get access to their internet. And so if a podcaster wants to really move across Africa, they place their content in video format on these platforms. And so that is one major way of distributing across Africa. For countries and people, and even if you're sitting in this room and you maybe have an option to opt out of some of these platforms, it's literally for some people the only way that they can access a data plan that's affordable enough to actually scroll through on Meta Lite or Facebook Lite. I'm not sure what the current name is. You actually have that as the main way that you access the internet. So for all intents and purposes, if you are a podcaster and you're starting out and you really want to even start listening to podcasts, that's the way to go. For download, if you have access to Wi-Fi, and that's a very small number of people in each country, you end up kind of finding who has free Wi-Fi. Your school, maybe your workplace. Sorry employers, that's where people actually end up downloading their podcasts to take with them to go. The other way is actually carrying literally like flash discs and saying, hey, I have this podcast, can I come and bring it over to you physically so that you can listen to it? And so some of the things that we take for granted as podcasters in terms of being able to be found on platforms, it really becomes an element of, can I be found on YouTube? Can I be found on Meta, Facebook? Can I be found on WhatsApp? Do I have a Telegram channel that I drop audio on and I have people who follow me on that platform? And also, can I get a little bit of extra revenue by connecting? And so people are monetizing their close friends bubbles. So some podcasters actually only do some of their, content around the close friends feature on Instagram. And so that's a way that they are able to kind of communicate what they're doing. And so they'll sit with a mic, like we're sitting here. Some of them have a huge listenership, huge viewership, and that's how they do that. But by and large, because a lot of the podcasters who are starting out have a mobile phone and a set of headphones, and that's the way they're starting out, a lot of the solutions are very tech light in terms of marketing and distribution, and heavy on social media, less relying on platforms rather than relying on podcast platforms. So a lot of what we do at Africa Podfest is trying to create learning opportunities so that people can start to understand how an RSS feed works and how it makes sense to put your content not just on these platforms, which you may or may not have access to in future, but actually having your own RSS feed, and the importance of kind of creating ways to sustain that content. For those who are journalists in the room who've worked across Africa, you'll find that a lot of those who are creating podcasts now really were spurred on because a lot of the radio is owned by corporations, government corporations, and so on. And so they wanted a way of capturing the interviews and the stories that they have. And so they've responded to podcasting in a way to kind of preserve the memory of some of these stories, which may or may not have an audience. And so the distribution of these stories becomes, I recorded my podcast so that if I was no longer available to share this, really important story, that would be the way that people find it on a podcast.
Thank you, Josephine. I do want to open the floor up for questions, if that's okay. I also want to tell you all, if you do catch any of these folks later on, ask Josephine about regulations in certain African countries and about how easy it actually is, because we do talk a lot about the threshold to making podcasts is super low. Everybody can make a podcast, but is it really? Ask her. And as well with Carolina has a lot to say about community building, how she went about doing that, and Ramsey making space in the Middle East right now for a lot. Sowt isn't the only podcasting studio. There's more, and how he goes about, bringing people together. I think that is unbelievably important. But before you do, are there any questions here on the floor that you'd like to ask? Otherwise, I've got yes. All right, I'll repeat the question for listeners at home. So the question is about what happens when funding is tied to language requirements. Is that right?
Like bilingual and then
yeah. So, and whether we have or you have faced any difficulties with that. Anybody want to take that?
I can talk just quickly about that, but I mean, you should too. So I think we've done some shows that are in English. So 95% of our work is in Arabic. And sometimes we have projects where they also want an English version or they also want an Arabic version. It depends. Usually, whoever the main audience is the original language. So if they want Arabic audience, then we'll produce it in Arabic and translate. I used to be quite against translating, and you'd want to kind of build the whole episode and whatnot. Now I think there's ways to do it, whether you dub it, whether you it's not word for word translation, but summaries and whatnot. But I think audio, in video it's very easy. I mean, there's subtitles, and so you can subtitle things. In audio, it's different. You have to work with voice actors. You have to translate things and then reread them and whatnot. But it's possible. and I think it's fruitful. We just did a few episodes, I think 5 episodes, that we produced in Arabic. We just translated them. And it took a lot longer. It was kind of this interesting exercise of what translating could seem like, and how we can produce it. We haven't released them yet, but it took a lot longer than we thought it would because it was kind of an interesting act to engage in. We had a really, what? Transcreate? Was it? No, there's another. No, I mean, it was an interesting name because we tried to, it was like found in translation instead of lost, the movie, lost in translation. I knew it was good. So.
Nice.
I just have to say that we have created this business model so I can focus on whatever we want to do, and basically because people were asking us to do what we didn't want to do. So we can give you funding, but can you do it in English? And I was like, no, dude, I'm just like talking to people who, I want to fill this gap for Spanish speakers who are not are neglected from every media here. The stories are nowhere to come. So it's not part of our business model. It's not that but we can cross borders somewhere else, like the language barrier. Like we can do it through Lupa, or we can some of our stories can be adapted to maybe I don't know, fictionalized to movies and TV, but we don't have that on the business model. We just focus on producing in Spanish.
So I think one of the big difficulties of working across Africa as an currently Anglophone-focused company is that we always feel like we are speaking to a very limited group. One fix that we found really, really works across the continent in terms of funding is, and I know I see partners across the continent who actually fund work in multiple languages and who create the context for podcast creators to create in those languages. I'll speak about the experience, for example, Africa No Filter. We've worked with them, and they are interested in shifting the narrative of Africa. And so they are really, really actively looking at ways of expanding the way language is used and really boosting funding for partners who are in, for example, Francophone countries where podcasting is not as widely distributed because of the creation of the content and the translation, and those kinds of elements are not necessarily there. I'll talk about the way that some podcasters who are in South Africa have talked about funders like SAMIP, hey Bella, who are really helping podcasters to create in the language that they wish to create, whether they're creating podcasts that are for a limited audience or they're media companies that are creating beyond that. So it's great that there are funders who are responding to the country context, who understand the country context across multiple African countries, and we are really excited to continue connecting with people who also feel that way, not only in Africa, but around the world, who also feel strongly about language. And I will say one last thing about making the podcast available using sign language and other accessible ways of doing that. There's at least one podcast out of South Africa, which is a mayor's office podcast, which they've posted their audio, and they have a sign language interpreter who actually translates into South African Sign Language. And so I think those are models of incorporating language that's not necessarily commonly thought of, but it is essentially a gap, a huge gap that's missing.
Thanks, Josephine. Thanks for that great question. Just a closing thought. I think Caroline put it really well. We don't necessarily need that much help. What we need is money. We don't need kind of the people from the global north to be so kind, to give us a platform, to give us a seat at the table, and all of these things. We shouldn't be defending our right to exist in these spaces. These are our spaces. We should be there. And all we need is a little bit of money, and then we can just help ourselves. It's fine. That is kind of, I think, a pretty fitting closing thought. There are a few more challenges on the road, but these folks have it. Clearly, everything is in good hands. And one of the challenges is discoverability, which hopefully maybe next year can be a panel. And thank you all for escaping the rain and being in here. Thank you so much for witnessing this very stumbling panel. So thank you. And thank you all